from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Caitlin Lyons.
Tonight, markets whipsawed as speculation over the Fed chair's future ramps up.
Job, but no, I'm not talking about that. Fortunately, we get to make a change in the next, 8 months or so. I don't rule out anything, but I think it's highly unlikely unless he has to leave for fraud.
President Trump denies he'll fire Jerome Powell, even as he floats the idea to Republicans, and some members of his administration push to oust the Fed chair.
We'll speak exclusively with one of them, FHFA Chair Director Bill Pulte, this hour, and get the reaction of Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee.
Plus, crypto week hits an impasse in the House. A number of Republicans stall progress on a key hurdle for a trio of bills. We'll have more on their objections and whether the legislation can get any Democratic support with Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois.
But we begin tonight live from the White House, where Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern has the latest developments involving President Trump and Fed Chair Powell. Annmarie, you were in the Oval Office with President Trump earlier, had the chance to question him about this.
Yeah, that's right. And the president said at this moment he has no plans to fire the Fed, although we should note he says he doesn't take anything off the table, but he says he has no plans to fire him, but he is looking forward to replacing him when the Fed chair and his chairmanship is up in May of next year, of 2026. There's been a lot of reporting that earlier, before we gathered with the president in the Oval Office, that he was preparing to take this step to fire the Fed chair. There's reports even that a letter was already drafted. He had waved that letter around yesterday evening when he met with House congressmen and women. And I asked him about that exactly. Did you draft this letter? What is in this letter? And he said he just discussed the concepts of firing the Fed chair with congressional lawmakers. He said they were the ones that were supportive of it, but he said that he is more conservative than they are. So at the moment, he doesn't have plans to fire the Fed chair. One thing was very clear, leaving that Oval Office, and almost if any day ends in the letter Y, the president is going to continuously tack the Fed chair. For months, it's been about where interest rates are, and he wants to see those interest rates coming down lower, even 1% or lower he's talked about. But now it's also about what the Fed is doing in terms of the renovations. There's been some swelling of costs. You even have Jay Powell looking to the Inspector General at the Fed to look into this. And this is a new line of attack, not just from the president, but other officials as well.
There's lots of reports coming into this meeting that you planned on firing Fed Chair Jay Powell. Markets reacted.
Is that right? Those are reports, but they're not true.
So what would be useful to know, are you committed to picking someone from the outside? Are you going to interview individuals that are on the board right now?
So many people that want that job. I have people that I've known a long time. They're calling me, begging for the job. You know what you need there? A smart person with common sense, but you need a very smart person for that job. I think it's one of the easiest jobs.
The president looking ahead to potentially these individuals he'll be sitting down with. The Treasury Secretary told us on surveillance just yesterday that the formal process has started, and the individual that's in front of the queue right now is the NEC Director, Kevin Hassett. Also, of course, Kevin Warsh's name continues to come up. Governor Waller, who's inside the Fed right now, is a potential contender. And there's always this idea that maybe it could be Scott Bessent, the current Treasury Secretary. I will say the Treasury Secretary told us that he is part of the process, and the president said that he likes him where he is at the moment, even though he could be an option.
All right, great reporting. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, we thank you so much. Now for a look at how the markets whipsawed after President Trump's latest criticism of the Fed chair, we turn now to Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. He joins us from World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Romaine.
Hey, yeah, whipsawed. I love that word, Tyler, because that is exactly what we saw in the markets, a sharp spike down in asset prices when we started to see some of those headlines that the potential for Fed Chair Jay Powell to be removed before his term is over. But then most of those negative reactions actually did unwind pretty quickly as the market started to reprice out that risk. But a couple of things lingered. One was in the Treasury space. You did see yields actually move materially, and more importantly, a steepening of the yield curve. And that was a sign that the market is actually starting to price in not only the possibility of lower rates, but the possibility of higher inflation. Contradictory, to be sure, but that is the big threat going on in this market right now. You're looking at the 10-year break even on your screen. This is basically the market pricing for expectations expectations for where inflation might be going forward. And the parlor game going on right now, Kaylee and Tyler, is the idea that no matter who Jay Powell's replacement is and whether that replacement comes today or in May of 2026, the idea is that they are either going to be much more dovish than what Jay Powell was, and that they would put much more pressure on the other members of the Fed to also be dovish. And that, well, yeah, that puts downward pressure on rates, but it also raises the prospect for higher inflation, and that could be a net negative for the markets. Maybe that's something you want to throw at Bill Pulte there, who's still on X making his case for why Jay Powell should be removed.
Oh, that's a great tease. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you so much, because joining us now for more insight on today's news regarding Jerome Powell is the aforementioned Bill Pulte, who is arguably the Trump administration's harshest critic of the Fed chair. He's the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, as well as the chair of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and is with us exclusively by phone on Bloomberg TV and radio. Director Pulte, we appreciate your time. The New York Times is reporting today that President Trump was given a draft letter firing Chairman Powell written by you. Have you drafted such a letter?
Well, I would never talk about anything that I have or haven't done in talking with the president, of course. I would say, however, that Jerome Powell is causing great devastation, in my view, to the housing market. Home builders in this country are not wanting to build inventory because in many ways they don't feel like they can move it after this inflation that's occurred for years now, for the last 4 years. And so we got a lot of work to do in the home building market, in the housing market after these last 4 years. And Jerome Powell, unfortunately, has made himself front and center as the obstacle in front of it.
But just to be clear, Director, you're not denying that you've drafted a letter.
Even if I had, I wouldn't say whether I had or hadn't, just because out of respect for the president, I wouldn't do. I don't comment on anything related to the president. I would just say very clearly that I believe that Jay Powell is the number one impediment from this economy becoming booming. And I hear that he's going to resign. I hear he's considering of resigning. I hear he's considering resigning. Now, whether or not he does, whether or not that's, going to come to bear, I don't know. But, we'll see what happens.
Okay. Well, I understand that you don't want to comment on something you've said to the president. I would wonder, though, something you've said publicly on X, Director. You said today, as someone with deep experience in construction, I'm requesting to tour the Fed building and the new ridiculous renovations, which I believe are riddled with fraud. My question, sir, is if you haven't actually seen the renovations yet, what evidence do you have that there has been fraud? Why should we not just see this as pretext for firing the chairman?
Well, I don't want to give into specifics about everything that I have seen. I've seen a lot of different information, as you can imagine. However, I would say that it is fairly obvious to anybody in construction, even if you don't have access to what you might have in the government. You do, as a construction person, realize that a $2.5 billion renovation does not make any sense. And when you combine it with this kind of egotistical, arrogant, pompous attitude that the Fed chair has, I think there's something very much going on here. I think it smells very bad. And the whole way that he just interacts with this whole subject, it's almost like we're inconveniencing him by asking him for basic information. And it's like, I run my agency, and when people ask me questions, I give them answers in a way that is at least like, hey, this belongs to the government. This belongs to the people. Jerome Powell, on the other hand, in my view, he acts like he's being inconvenienced by just basic questions. Why are there beehives reportedly at the Fed building? Why are we spending $2.5 billion? Why are there rooftop terraces? I mean, if you're a public servant and you're engaging in that type of behavior, you have to respond, and not in a very arrogant way. So I think it's a big issue, and I think it's not going to go away.
Director Pulte, there is a very high legal bar here. The law states that a Fed governor can only be removed for cause. Can you confirm, is the administration actively building a legal case here based on cause?
Well, I would refer you to the White House, and I'd refer you to the White House lawyers. Ultimately, the president will make whatever decision that he sees fit. And, of course, the president always follows the law, and he'll continue to do that. That will ultimately be up to the president. All I can tell you is, in charge of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I see the devastation every day that is occurring as a result of these interest rates being kept high relative to inflation. Inflation for the last 3 months is at 1.6% on a run rate basis. There's no basis to have these rates at 4.5%. Interest rates on mortgages have gone from 3% in President Trump's first term to 7%. It's time that Jerome Powell resign. And as I said, I hear that he's considering resigning, and I hope he does it very soon.
Director, I want to ask you about something that you have done. You have called on Congress to investigate this. Can you confirm to us which specific committee in Congress you have asked this of, and whether or not you've gotten confirmation that this is an investigation that is actually going to be launched?
I'm very confident that oversight will look at it. We'll see what happens. We'll have to see what they end up doing. I'm very confident that any other appropriate oversight governance in Congress will look at it. I actually have a phone call here in a minute with a congressman on this very issue. So I think a lot of people are concerned, and I'll tell you this, I've been on the internet a long time, and this is something that the average American is very upset about. They are very upset about this building. It doesn't make any mathematical sense, and the way that they're justifying spending $2.5 billion, it just doesn't smell right. It doesn't smell right at all.
Director Pulte, you've said a few times now in this conversation that you've heard that the chairman is considering resigning. Where exactly are you hearing that?
Well, I hear it basically every day, to be honest. I hear it from different
people
legislators.
Inside the Fed?
I hear it from different legislators who've heard from inside the Fed. I hear it from lobbyists, both Democrat lobbyists as well as Republican lobbyists who are talking about it. It is something where you hear it from there. And then I hear it also from other officials at my level who have met with Jerome Powell and say that he's just absolutely fatigued and beleaguered and doesn't look great. I wish no ill will on Jerome Powell, but, his time has come, and the president has made clear that he doesn't want him here, and it's time for this gentleman to leave. I will say one thing, too, is, even before I began calling for his resignation, he was very unhappy to see me about a month or two ago, and I was just asking questions because I'm in charge of many aspects of housing. Why are these rates high? And just, again, this kind of negative, pompous attitude just doesn't even allow you to ask him basic questions.
Director, just for clarity, when you are talking about members of the administration calling for him to resign, are we talking about just stepping down as Fed chair or also being removed from the board of governors as well? What's the ultimate goal here from the White House?
Well, I don't want to speak on behalf of the White House or any other officials, but from my perspective, I think that he needs to step down, not just as chairman, but as governor. And we need to move on from this national nightmare, which is Jerome Powell. Look, we're talking about one person. Why are we so obsessed every day with one person who's holding back this entire economy? He needs to move on with his life, and he needs to let the country move on with his life.
But Director Pulte, he may be one person, but he is not one unilateral voice on the Federal Open Market Committee. Even if he goes away, there are still many others who might make the case that interest rates need to stay where they are because of the president's tariff policy and uncertainty around inflation. Why target just the one individual when you have the rest of the FOMC to contend with?
Well, I'm not targeting one individual. I'm saying that this gentleman is enormously powerful. He's in the position of chairmanship. And when he gets in front of Congress and he goes out every day and he talks about how tariffs are impacting inflation, it's not based on data. It's not based in any rational way, any way, shape, or form. He can't provide any data that shows any basis for him, hallucinating these tariffs that he claims are there when they're not there. So I disagree with your premise that, other members of the committee and of the board are going to think that. I think that the chairman is the leader, and so long as he continues to say this nonsense, it's going to continue to hold back the Fed and hold back the economy from where it could be.
All right, Bill Pulte, director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, we thank you for joining Bloomberg. And we should also just note that the Federal Reserve has said that Jerome Powell's testimony to Congress has been truthful. Coming up, President Trump appears to dial back rhetoric on China in order to advance trade talks. We'll discuss more with Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi. He's the ranking member on the House China Select Committee. But first, we'll continue with the conversation on the president denying he'll dismiss the Fed chair. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts joins us up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The crypto legislation that is on the floor is within other committees of jurisdiction from the House Ways and Means Committee. We're working on our own crypto items that's not on the floor. But I truly believe that we'll be able to iron it out, get it together, and pass it.
Republican Congressman Jason Smith of Missouri, the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, sounding optimistic on the early edition of Balance of Power today about the forward progress in the House's crypto week. But things have since stalled out. And joining us now with the latest here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Bloomberg's Erik Wasson, who is live from Capitol Hill. So, Erik, as of last night, I thought President Trump had a deal with the holdouts, and yet here we are with them still holding out.
Yeah, it's been another sort of chaotic day here on Capitol Hill. We saw the crypto week try to revive itself in the House. The Freedom Caucus is still at odds with members of the House Financial Services Committee led by French Hill, the chairman. They want to see a central bank digital currency banned through legislation, and they want that legislation attached to a market structure bill for digital currencies. There's a feeling among the other members of the Financial Services Committee that's a poison pill that will essentially guarantee that the market structure bill dies in the Senate. So there's an ongoing discussion about how to get this vote across. Right now the Freedom Caucus is holding out, refusing to pass this rule. We saw this during the tax bill debate where a rule vote was brought to the House and just kept open for hours and hours, and that's where we are now. But overall, it's been a pretty chaotic day here. We heard that the president was likely to fire Jerome Powell in a meeting with these Freedom Caucus holdouts, apparently waving around a letter. But then the president coming out and saying he is in no hurry to do that, doesn't think he's going to do that. The Speaker of the House coming out doubting there's a legal authority to do that, even if it's proven that the renovations are over budget. Meanwhile, in the Senate, there's a rescissions bill up, a Vote-A-Rama, a nonstop amendment vote to try to pass $9 billion in spending cuts. This would end PBS and NPR federal funding, and we're expecting a vote later today.
All right, Bloomberg's Erik Wasson, we thank you so much for your reporting. And we turn now to the future of the Federal Reserve. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had this to say on Bloomberg TV yesterday about the search for Powell's successor.
President Trump said numerous times he's not going to fire Jay Powell. He's working the refs. He's not looking to fire Chair Powell. There's a formal process that's already starting. There are a lot of great candidates. And we'll see how rapidly it progresses. It's President Trump's decision, and it will move at his speed. Traditionally, the Fed chair also steps down as a governor, and there's been a lot of talk of a shadow Fed chair causing confusion in advance of his or her nomination. And I can tell you, I think it'd be very confusing for the market for a former Fed chair to stay on also.
Those remarks came before reports circulated this morning. The president had a letter in hand firing Fed Chair Jerome Powell. The president has since denied taking that step, but his continued attacks call into question the future of the central bank's independence. And Kaylee, it really is a question right now that we're grappling with when it comes to the legal basis that the administration could act on this.
Yeah, even if he wanted to try to do this, he still might have to contend with the courts. And then it becomes a question, of course, of who could replace the chairman. Interestingly, that Scott Bessent has been mentioned in those conversations, as has the likes of Kevin Hassett, the NEC director, which raises questions about how much the next Fed chair could be aligned with President Trump on monetary policy.
Exactly. The president actually name-dropped Kevin Hassett in the Oval Office earlier on today. So joining us now with perspective is Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee. Senator, thanks so much for joining Bloomberg. Sure. You've been a longtime critic of Jerome Powell, but now it's our understanding that you're defending him in this regard. I'm wondering, do you disagree with the criticism of the Fed chair's performance or just the suggestion that he should be fired over it?
Look, I have made clear for a long time that I disagree with Jerome Powell on monetary policy and on regulatory oversight. And I've been open and vocal and quite public about all of that. But I have no hesitation about saying that the Fed chair is independent. I will try to persuade him about what I think he should be focusing on interest rates or on oversight of the giant banks. But that's all I can do or anyone else. Try to persuade. Donald Trump's efforts to try to fire him, first of all, would be illegal, but more importantly, will tank the markets. We got a taste of that back in March when Trump said that that's what he wanted to do. And the rest of the world effectively said through the bond market, whoa, I'm not so sure we can count on the stability and independence of the U.S. financial system. So Trump backed up on that, but he continues to say maybe he'll fire him, maybe he won't. And understand, there's a real cost to that. Donald Trump is burning U.S. credibility in our financial system all around the world.
So, Senator, to build off of that, though, do you share the president's hope that the next Fed chair will be more inclined to lower rates?
Look, what I want is a Fed chair who's going to be independent. And given that every nominee that we've seen that Donald Trump has run through here in the Senate for confirmation has started out with effectively a loyalty oath to Donald Trump. And when we ask them about the things they're going to do as the Secretary of Education or the Secretary of Defense, they all just say, I'll do whatever Donald Trump tells me to do. Well, that may work for cabinet officials, but the Fed is different. The Fed is independent. Part of how we get the strength of the Fed is that it doesn't move with the political winds. So sure, I'd like to see someone who is going to reduce interest rates. I'd like to see someone who's going to be tougher on big banks. But Donald Trump is burning his own credibility and the credibility of whomever he nominates to be chairman of the Federal Reserve every time he stands up and indicates that he thinks he has the right to fire them because they're not doing what he wants.
Well, so, Senator, on the question of credibility, if we were to see the nomination of someone like Kevin Hassett or Scott Bessent, who are already serving in the Trump administration, would that meet the independence criteria you're talking about in your mind?
No. Look, people in the cabinet, people who are serving in the administration, serve at the pleasure of the president. That is the structure. That is fine. Donald Trump wants to get mad at one of them and fire him. Have at it, baby. But it's different for the Fed chair, and that is why that office needs to be held by someone who is independent. Someone who looks at the economic data and says, look, my job as chair of the Fed is to do what I believe is best in the interests of the economy of the United States, not what is in the political interests of the President of the United States. And I get it. There may be calls around the margins about, is that the right here? Is that what's happening? But that's got to be the structure you start with. And Donald Trump is just trying to set that on fire. He thinks everybody has to start out by bending the knee to Donald Trump. And that is wrong, and it is costly in our financial system.
Senator, I'd like to switch gears here as we have this conversation over in the other chamber. There is a vote still open in the House to try to pass a procedural hurdle to move forward with a trio of pieces of crypto legislation, all part of Crypto Week, one being the Genius Act, the Stablecoin Bill, of course, the Clarity Act, which is a market structure bill, and some anti-CBDC legislation. While the House struggles to find a way forward, you would like to see none of these bills passed, correct? If the Clarity Act comes to the U.S. Senate, you would not be in support.
Look, I want to see us do strong crypto regulation. But what I don't want to do is see the United States government just sign off on very weak regulation that has been written by the industry. The problem with the Stablecoin Bill and the Clarity Bill in particular is that they don't do anything about the Donald Trump corruption that is occurring right out in plain view. They also don't put enough safeguards in place for consumer protection, to make sure that terrorists and human traffickers and drug traffickers can't use the system, and guardrails to make sure that crypto isn't used to blow up our entire economy. So I'm very worried about that, but I want to add one more twist, and that is the Clarity Bill has all those problems, but it also has a provision in it that would let any company listed on the New York Stock Exchange opt out of SEC regulation by just digitizing themselves, put themselves on the blockchain, and all of a sudden it turns out that Amazon or Meta or General Motors is no longer governed by the SEC. You do realize that literally would blow up the value of the New York Stock Exchange. that whole stock exchange has been a goose that has laid a lot of golden eggs for people in New York City, for people around the country and around the world. And this would basically just take a baseball bat to it by saying any company that doesn't want to have its books audited and make sure that it's following certain consumer protections and so on can just go somewhere else and be traded on the blockchain. There is nobody in Congress who should support that.
All right, Senator, in just the final minute that we have left with you, I want to pivot to some other news of the day, which is the rescissions package. Republicans are saying that Democrats could shut down the government over this. Is this something that the party would be willing to do instead of striking an appropriations deal with Republicans?
Look, we're just trying to ask the question of what does an appropriations deal mean? When the parties sit down, Democrats and Republicans, they work out a budget, and then after that's done, Republicans come back and say, hey, remember the price we agreed to? We just want to take your parts back. And look, where are they trying to do it? U.S. aid. There are even Republicans who are saying this makes no sense at all. We're cutting off food aid, we're cutting off aid in countries that have an epidemic of AIDS. We're cutting off the help that lets little babies be born now to mamas that are dealing with AIDS, but the baby can be born AIDS-free because of the assistance we give. And that is pennies on the dollar for the return that it gives to global health and will ultimately help keep us safer here in the United States. And the Republicans want to cut that out after we've all allocated the money and agreed to it. That's just wrong. Come on, guys.
All right, Senator, we appreciate you joining us here on Balance of Power. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee. Thank you so much for your time. And we go back to where we began with the Senator Trump's criticism of the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, who we will now remind you was first nominated by Trump back in 2017.
We need strong, sound, and steady leadership at the United States Federal Reserve. I have nominated Jay to be our next federal chairman, and so important because he will provide exactly that type of leadership. He's strong, he's committed, he's smart.
Now, fast forward to today, roughly 8 years later, when President Trump said this in the Oval Office.
He's a terrible Fed chair. I was surprised he was appointed. I was surprised, frankly, that Biden put him in and extended him, but they did.
This, of course, as President Trump pushes back on reports that he's planning on firing Chairman Powell. And joining us with the latest here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Bloomberg's Michael McKee, our international economics and policy correspondent. So what a difference 8 years can make, Mike. But, of course, even if President Trump wanted to fire the chair, there is a massive question as to whether or not legally he can do so and what effect, frankly, it would actually have on monetary policy.
Well, that's the interesting thing, Kaylee, about all of this is Donald Trump may be getting more forgetful as he gets older. But somebody on his staff, perhaps Scott Bessent, has to tell him that he's not going to get what he wants from any of this other than if he wants to vent. There is a question about whether he can legally fire Jay Powell as both chair or as a governor. The law says that the Fed governors can only be fired for cause, and there doesn't seem to be any cause other than this kerfuffle over the Fed building. And we'd have to see whether a court would decide there's cause in there. The Mr. Pulte's allegations may not be correct. There isn't clarity on whether they can demote the Fed chairman, but then you don't have anybody you can put in as Fed chair. So you got to, other than if they want to elevate Chris Waller, but Waller is a Fed person through and through. So he doesn't end up with lower interest rates. So what's kind of the point here, other than perhaps, I don't want to go all tinfoil hat on you, but we are spending all day talking about Jay Powell. We are not talking about Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, Mike, can we also just drill down a little bit on the timeline here? Of course, the Powell's term as chair is up in May of 2026, but he could stay on as governor through 2028. How does that sort of complicate the administration's goal here when we're looking at the broader FOMC?
Well, there are a couple of complications, but the biggest one is that there is only one seat coming up in January that the president could fill before the end of his term, basically, unless Powell resigns as a governor when he is no longer the chair. So for the administration, it's a question of, do you put somebody in January that you think is going to be the chair, or you plan to make the chair? The markets will interpret it that way. And then how do the markets take that person, and how do you live for 5 months with a chair in waiting and the whole shadow chair thing? So that's a real question for the administration, and maybe why Powell is not saying he will resign, because he's trying to use that as leverage with the administration to at least get someone acceptable to the Fed appointed as chair. And the other aspect for the administration when they think about this is, who do they put in there? And if Powell is still around, does Powell try to undermine them? This only happened once before, when Mariner Eccles stayed on the Fed after being demoted from chair. He was asked to resign as part of a deal with the Treasury, and he was asked to stay on the Fed because of his years of experience. So he did for a couple of years, but there was never any animosity between him and the new chair, Thomas McKee, and so the Fed got along fine for a couple of years that way. But this kind of situation we've never seen before.
All right, a lot to contend with, to say the least. Bloomberg's Michael McKee, we thank you so much. And another story we're tracking are the ongoing trade negotiations. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent yesterday provided this status update on trade talks when it comes to China.
They had things we wanted, we had things they wanted, and we're in a very good place. I expect to meet my Chinese counterpart, the Vice Premier, in the next few weeks.
Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Michael Shepard. Mike, we're perhaps hearing a tone shift from President Trump. In his words yesterday, he said when confronting China, it'll be in a very friendly fashion. Where is this heading as the administration is really looking to get a deal with Beijing?
Well, Tyler, we really have detected a shift in the wind here. The president is angling for this meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. He has spoken of his rapport with the Chinese leader in a number of public settings already. Last week, we saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio meeting with his Chinese counterpart to perhaps set the stage for an encounter between the two leaders toward the end of the year. And all of this, of course, stands in contrast with some of the harsher rhetoric aimed at traditional U.S. allies, the European Union and Brazil. But we've also gotten some good reporting from colleagues Jenny Leonard and Mackenzie Hawkins that shows behind the scenes, Donald Trump is also one of the least hawkish voices inside the room. And that is also a little bit of a shift from what we heard on the campaign trail, and also really from the direction of travel here in Washington. It's been in vogue, of course, to be a China hawk, and U.S. policy has really taken that on as an article of faith. We saw a shift also with the most recent deal to speed the exports of rare earths from China to the U.S., something that a number of U.S. industries, especially autos, have been clamoring for. But that also included something that Beijing wanted. They wanted an easing of export controls. And we found out yesterday that that also included the release of these H20 chips from Nvidia and other chips made by AMD for AI purposes.
That's absolutely right. And we saw the reaction we saw in those stocks yesterday as a result. Bloomberg's Michael Shepard covering strategic technologies and strategic industries for us here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much. And joining us now with his view is Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, the ranking member of the House China Select Committee, who's with us live from Capitol Hill. Congressman, thank you for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio, as always. To the point Mike was just making on Nvidia now being able to sell these H20 chips in China, knowing those export controls were put into place so that China could not get its hands on advanced semiconductor technology. Do you believe that was the right decision?
No, absolutely not. It's not only inconsistent with what the Trump administration had pursued over the last, in its first administration, as well as what the Biden administration pursued. It's going to be handing over our top technology to basically Chinese Communist Party controlled entities that are going to work against our interests or values. They're going to use these chips to power artificial intelligence models, which will then help to modernize their military and be used to persecute minorities, such as the Uyghurs, through their massive techno-authoritarian system. So this is a horrible move.
So, Congressman, when you hear the Treasury Secretary say that part of this move was to make good on the deal that was reached in London, in your view, what is the best way for the administration to thread the needle here when we do have to make progress when it comes to trade talks with Beijing?
Well, first of all, don't compromise your national security. That is sacrosanct. You don't basically bargain away national security in return for, extra goods and services from China. I think what you have to do is you have to be tough on the national security issues while, continuing to negotiate on other parameters. And I think that right now, not only are we compromising our national security, but we're also kind of in a situation where those export licenses for those rare earths that he's been touting, Donald Trump has been touting, that has been supposedly approved by China, those have not been provided at the rate that we were expecting either. So I think at this point, we're once again in a situation where I don't think a lot of progress has been made, and yet Nvidia is still also, I believe, compromising our national security and be able to sell these H20 chips to the CCP-controlled entities that it is.
Congressman, we heard from President Trump at the beginning of this week that he is looking at, within the end of a 50-day window, if there's no ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, putting in place secondary tariffs on buyers of Russian oil, of which, of course, China is a big one. Would you be supportive of that idea? Would you expect that to change China's behavior buying cheap crude and energy products from Russia?
Yeah, I would absolutely consider. I think that the Russians are kind of in a situation where they're taking advantage of certain loopholes in our laws. But all that being said, I think that right now, Donald Trump needs to expedite the delivery of various weapon systems to the Ukrainians, because only on the battlefield can they gain the leverage necessary to win, a real truce or something that is approximating a truce at the negotiating table on terms that they can live with.
Congressman, I want to stick on the idea of tariffs, because we are expecting semiconductor tariffs to be in the pipeline, for example, under Section 232 on the grounds of national security concerns, which you've been talking about in this conversation. Is this a policy that you support in terms of building up our own domestic chip supply chain?
I think certain strategic tariffing makes sense, especially where there's an unlevel playing field. So, for instance, if they're going to be, exporting or dumping legacy chips on the American market to drive out of business certain American companies, then we have to tariff those chips to make sure that our industries can survive. But blanket tariffs on everything, which is what's basically happening right now with regard to not only China, but also with regard to other countries, including our allies like Canada and Mexico, blanket tariffs lead to increased prices, and it pushes away our friends, partners, and allies at a time when we need them to, basically curb the aggression of countries like China.
Congressman, as we have this conversation and you're joining us from the Hill, I believe, in fact, the House of Representatives still has a vote open, as has been open for hours, on the rule, the procedural hurdle that would allow for the advancement of defense appropriations bill, but also, of course, this trio of crypto bills as part of Crypto Week. We understand some of the consternation may be around the idea of trying to shove some of these components together and that creating a problem for Democrats in the House specifically. Where do you stand on these various pieces of legislation and whether or not you would support them being combined in any fashion?
Well, I think that what's really going on is that there's a intramural battle right now among Republicans where they're basically trying to add amendments which end up being poison pills for the legislation for a lot of Democrats, and it essentially makes it impossible to pass. Regardless, I don't know when they're going to sort out their differences at this point. We've been waiting, I think, 4 hours, and I think there's some kind of there's a women's softball game that they are also pausing for at this point. And I think that I'm not sure when we're going to come back to vote on any of these bills.
So for clarity, Congressman, what sort of regulatory framework would you support when it does come to the future of regulation of the crypto industry?
Well, I think that you need to have a regulatory framework because they're being traded and being utilized by our constituents on a wide scale basis. I think that, in the past, I voted for the FIT 21 framework, which made sense. I'm going to seriously consider what's before us now. But the bottom line is any kind of provision or insertion of a poison pill is not going to go over well with anybody, I think.
All right. Democratic Congressman Krishnamurthi of Illinois, we thank you for joining Bloomberg. Coming up, the Crown Prince of Bahrain announced $17 billion worth of deals with the U.S. during his meeting with President Trump earlier today. We'll discuss those details next when we assemble our political panel here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Tyler Kendall. Here are some of the other stories we're following in today's Bloomberg Power Brief. Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic nominee for mayor of New York City, was here in Washington today. He met privately with top progressive lawmakers. The attendees reportedly included Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders. Mamdani met with over 100 business leaders last night in New York City. That included those from top banks, investment, real estate, and law firms in a bid to shore up support. We should point out Michael R. Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg News' parent company, Bloomberg LP, endorsed Andrew Cuomo in the primary and has contributed to his PAC.
And in a post on Truth Social, the president says that Coca-Cola has agreed to use real cane sugar in their Coke soda in the U.S. The president writing, "I'd like to thank all of those in authority at Coca-Cola. This will be a very good move by them. You'll see, it's just better." Coca-Cola uses high fructose corn syrup in original Coke. The stock was unchanged in extended trading, but shares of Archer Daniels Midland, a Coca-Cola supplier that makes this type of syrup, fell about 5.5% on the news.
And in between the talks of tariffs and the future of the Federal Reserve, Bahrain's Crown Prince pledged a major investment today. Came during a visit to the Oval Office with President Trump earlier.
We will be discussing security issues, we'll be discussing trade and investment, which is very important. We're very happy to be announcing $17 billion worth of deals that are coming to the United States. And this is real. This isn't...
it's real money.
These aren't fake deals.
The Crown Prince did not provide details of that investment pledge, but Bloomberg reports Bahrain is considering the purchase of roughly a dozen Boeing 737 Dreamliners. And joining us now with their reaction to this and all of today's stories is this evening's political panel. Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden and Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Brittany Martinez, executive director of Principles First. Welcome to you both. Obviously, while the Bahraini Crown Prince was in the Oval Office today, the conversation between the two of them was completely upstaged by questions around whether or not President Trump was intending to fire the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. He did not. Or he is not, he says, Megan, but it still dominated the news cycle today. And I wonder if you think that actually might have been the intention.
Absolutely. I think he's trying to change the conversation away from the Epstein files, which is the other story dominating the news cycle. But I do think markets were impacted. And then when he said he's not going to fire them, they went back to normal. So I think Donald Trump can't actually fire him. So I'm not exactly sure why we're talking about this, except to change the conversation.
Well, we actually heard from President Trump, of course, about this. Our own colleague, Annmarie Hordern, asked him about these reports that he had a letter in hand to do so. We want to play you some of his response and their question and answer exchange.
There's lots of reports coming into this meeting that you planned on firing Fed Chair Jay Powell. Markets reacted.
Is that right? Those are reports, but they're not true.
So what would be useful to know, are you committed to picking someone from the outside? Are you going to interview individuals that are
so
on the
many
board
people
right
that
now?
want that job. I have people that I've known a long time. They're calling me, begging for the job. You know what you need there? A smart person with common sense, but you need a very smart person for that job. I think it's one of the easiest jobs.
So, Brittany, what is the tightrope that Republicans have to walk here when it comes to backing President Trump's criticism, but also perhaps putting at risk the credibility and independence of the central bank?
I think at this point, Republicans are kind of just going to fall in line with the president and sort of support or parrot the things that he's going to say. And listen, this is coming from someone who is a Republican. The president said today, oh, I don't know why Biden put him in there and extended his time. I'm sorry, Mr. President, did you forget you're the one who appointed him during your first term? And I think that the facts often don't matter, in my opinion, from what I see coming out of the Trump administration. And I think that Republicans are probably going to just fall in line and do as the president says.
Well, I'd like to talk more about Republicans falling in line, because we thought we saw more evidence of that last night when, after a failure to pass a procedural hurdle to advance crypto legislation in the House, Trump called those 11 of 12, I think, holdouts to the White House and emerged from that meeting saying, I've struck a deal with them. They are now going to pass the rule. Guess what vote is still open hours later, Brittany? The rule is not yet on track to pass. And I wonder if you think we might finally be at an instance in which the holdovers are not going to roll over for President Trump.
I mean, there's a lot of them, too. I think there's still 12 at this point, and the vote has been open for hours, I think, since 12:30-ish. Do I think that ultimately this will probably pass the House? I think so. Speaker Johnson, he has gotten criticisms sometimes, but he's been very good at being able to get his conference in line, and I think he'll be able to whip them along with Emmer and along with President Trump to get them over the finish line.
Well, Megan, let's actually talk about the legislation that we're talking about here when it comes to those crypto bills. And we have to keep in mind here, the crypto industry gave record amounts of money during the 2024 cycle. It's going to be something that's going to come up in the midterms, too. How are Democrats perhaps capitalizing on this as we are still seeing this debate underway right now?
I think that Democrats are capitalizing on watching the Republican caucus fall apart. I think a lot of Republicans are moving in a different direction from the president. I think they're seeing how bad the big, beautiful bill is for them and seeing how hard it is to sell. And more Republicans that are in these frontline districts do not want another bill that is going to be hard for them to sell to their districts in the midterms. They will lose. And I think they are starting to realize that.
Are they realizing rescissions may be hard to sell as well? Because that's also an open question in the Senate. The procedural hurdles there were only passed because J.D. Vance came in with the tiebreaker.
I mean, I don't think that cutting money for global aid and PBS and NPR are popular for anybody. I don't think that that's something that this is not why people go to Congress. So I do think these are hard votes for them to take. And they are realizing what the place that their loyalty is putting them in. To be loyal to Donald Trump, what is that going to cost them? And a lot of them, it's going to cost them their seats.
Well, to this point on hard votes, Brittany, we did see some provisions stripped out of the rescissions package when it did come to Republicans, including aid for the Global AIDS Fund. What else are you watching here? Is there going to be any other sort of compromises to get this over the finish line? How hard a vote actually is this going to be for some of those more moderate Republicans?
I think that we saw, obviously, Collins, McConnell, and Murkowski who voted against it. That's why J.D. Vance had to come in. I think that the broadcasting stuff really does matter a lot to some of those rural senators. I think that's something that people are going to be making an argument for and making sure that that is something that is not included anymore and that the rescissions for those PBS, NPR are there. I mean, we as Republicans like to say that we believe in freedom of speech, freedom of press, and I think that when we are sort of stripping that away, that's going to affect Americans, and they're paying attention.
Well, when we consider this rescissions effort, this is still a relatively small package. This is $9 billion we're talking about. This was supposed to be an easy one that sets the stage for even more rescissions down the line. And Brittany, I wonder if you see the difficulty with this package as potentially being a bit foreboding for the rest of the clawback that the Trump administration would like to pursue.
I think so, and I saw some senators talking about it. The percentage that this bill is as far as funding to all the funding that the federal government does or Congress does for all sorts of bills and agencies and whatnot. And it is such a small percentage, but I do think that this sort of signals a warning shot, I guess, to the administration of, listen, this is going to be more difficult than you intended. We do know that in the Senate you have those folks, probably more so than the House, who are more senior, who are more willing to push back than some of those House members, even though we're seeing them still do that today. And so I think that's something to keep attention on.
Well, Megan, in our final minute here, we'll give you the last word because Republicans are messaging on this that Democrats could shut down the government over this. Is that something that the party would be willing to risk in terms of not striking a deal on appropriations with Republicans?
I really hope that they do not shut down the government without a way to reopen it. And that's why they didn't shut down last time, because they did not have a way to reopen. So I think that they need to really think through their strategy if they're going to vote to shut down the government. Democrats need to work with Republicans to keep the government open. That is a fail for all Americans at every level to shut down the government.
So you think it would be more politically damaging to Democrats than Republicans, in theory, if we get a shutdown?
If they do not have a way to reopen the government and have no leverage to reopen it, then it will be extremely politically damaging to them.
Do you view it the same way, Brittany?
I think Republicans are in charge of both chambers, so I think that they're the ones who have to lose here, and it's the White House for Republicans, too, so.
Interesting, Tyler, to hear the Republicans saying it'll be on the Republicans and the Democrats saying Democrats will have to own it. I would have expected that to go the other way.
It's going to be something that we are watching incredibly closely here. Megan Hayes and Brittany Martinez, we thank you both so much for joining us today. And for more on all the stories that we discussed, check out our Washington edition newsletter. It's on the terminal and online.
And of course, in the meantime, Tyler, we're still watching the Capitol Hill right now, both chambers of Congress, as we were just discussing. There is still a vote open in the House of Representatives. It is not clear whether or not this rule that would allow them to move forward on 3 pieces of crypto legislation and defense appropriations is going to have the vote to pass. Right now, it's 209 to 220 no's. So that's looking difficult. And of course, it is later on this evening that the Senate is expected to take a final passage vote on rescissions, with a Vote-A-Rama still ongoing. We've had a lot of Vote-A-Ramas we've had to deal with lately.
Right, and exactly to your point, like we talk a lot about here in Washington, once it gets through the House, we're going to have to send some of this legislation over to the Senate, where it might be a completely different story, and we're going to have to see which of these chambers ultimately ends up winning on the policy front.
Yep, hopefully we'll have an answer to that by tomorrow, when we'll be back here on Balance of Power. So have a great evening, and we'll see you for the Thursday edition later on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.